At 45,000 feet in the air, a little girl named Blossom snatched a cup of water from the hands of a flight attendant who had refused to help a choking woman. What happened next changed 3 lives forever. The flight attendant thought she had power. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Stay until the end because this story will restore your faith and courage. Now, before we dive into how an 8-year-old girl became a hero and changed her family's destiny in a single moment, let me take you back to where it all began. Back to a Tuesday morning in Atlanta, where the air was thick with humidity and possibility, and a father and daughter were about to board a flight that would alter the course of their lives. Blossom Okafor was 8 years old, but she carried herself with the kind of awareness that made adults do a double take. Her eyes were bright, full of curiosity and an intelligence that seemed too large for her small frame. She wore a purple dress that day, covered in delicate butterfly patterns that her grandmother had sewn by hand before she passed. The butterflies seemed to dance across the fabric when she moved, and Blossom loved that dress more than anything else in her closet. Not because it was pretty, though it was, but because it reminded her of transformation. Her grandmother used to tell her that butterflies were proof that struggle could lead to something beautiful. Blossom was fearless in the way that only children who have faced real loss can be. She observed everything around her with careful attention, taking in details that most people missed. Her father had raised her to speak up against injustice, to never let fear silence her voice when someone needed help. But that lesson had been carved even deeper into her heart by tragedy. 2 years earlier, Blossom's mother had fallen ill suddenly while they were at a shopping mall. She collapsed, struggling to breathe, her face contorted in pain. People had walked past them. Some had stared. A few had pulled out their phones, but not to call for help, just to record. By the time someone finally stopped to assist, precious minutes had been lost. Her mother died 3 days later in the hospital. The doctors said that if she had received help immediately, she might have survived. Blossom remembered every detail of that day. The cold floor beneath her knees as she knelt beside her mother. The way people's eyes had slid past them as if they were invisible. The helplessness that had wrapped around her like chains. She had made herself a promise that day, standing beside her mother's hospital bed. She would never stand by and watch someone suffer when she had the power to help. Never. That promise was about to be tested at 45,000 feet in the air. Blossom was traveling with her father, Jidenna Okafor, on a flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles. They sat in the business class cabin, a luxury that Jidenna normally wouldn't have afforded, but this trip was too important. Everything was riding on it. Jidenna Okafor was a man who wore his struggles quietly. At 45 years old, he was tall and broad-shouldered, his muscular build a testament to decades of construction work. His hands were calloused and strong, hands that had laid foundations, erected walls, and built dreams from the ground up. His beard was salt and pepper now, more salt than pepper these days, and it framed a face that was kind but tired. When he smiled, his eyes crinkled at the corners in a way that made you feel safe, like everything was going to be okay even when it wasn't. Jidenna had immigrated to America from Nigeria at 19 with nothing but $200, a duffel bag of clothes, and a determination that burned like fire in his chest. He had worked construction jobs for years, learning every aspect of the trade, saving every penny he could. Eventually, he started his own company, Okafor & Sons, specializing in sustainable commercial developments. For a while, things had gone well. He married the love of his life, they had Blossom, and his business was growing. But after his wife's death, everything began to crumble. Grief had made it hard to focus. He missed deadlines, made mistakes, and then he started losing contracts. Big contracts. The kind that kept the company alive. 3 major projects in the past year had gone to competitors, companies with connections, with friends in high places, with the right last names and the right skin color. Jidenna never said it out loud, but he knew. He had felt the shift in rooms when he walked into pitch. The polite smiles that never reached the eyes. The phrases like, "We're going in a different direction," and "We'll keep you in mind for future opportunities." His company was now on the verge of bankruptcy. He had maybe 3 months of operating funds left, and that was if he stretched every dollar until it screamed. This trip to Los Angeles was his last shot. He had managed to secure meetings with 3 potential investors, though he wasn't sure how much faith he had left. Still, he had to try. He had made a promise to his wife as she lay dying, her hand weak in his. He had promised her he would give Blossom the best life possible, that their daughter would never want for anything, that she would grow up knowing she was loved and protected and capable of anything. Jidenna was fighting to keep that promise, even as the ground beneath him felt like it was giving way. He glanced over at Blossom as they settled into their seats. She had her nose pressed against the airplane window, watching the ground crew load luggage below. She was his whole world. His reason for waking up every morning and fighting through the exhaustion and the fear. When he looked at her, he saw his wife's smile, her determination, her goodness. Blossom was everything beautiful that had ever happened to him, and he would burn the world down before he let it break her spirit. But what Jadena didn't know was that in a few short hours, it wouldn't be him protecting Blossom. It would be Blossom saving him. 3 rows ahead of them sat a woman who looked like she had been carved from elegance and grace. Evangeline Hartwell was 62 years old, though she carried her age like a crown rather than a burden. Her silver locks fell past her shoulders, each one perfectly maintained, shimmering like threads of moonlight against her dark skin. She wore a tailored cream suit that fit her like it had been made specifically for her body, which it had. Everything about Evangeline was understated but unmistakably expensive. Her jewelry was simple, a pair of diamond studs, a thin gold watch, a wedding band she still wore even though her husband had passed 5 years ago. But if you looked closely, you'd notice that the watch was a vintage Patek Philippe, worth more than most people's cars. On her lap sat a leather briefcase, buttersoft and worn in the way that only comes from years of use and care. Embossed on the front in discreet gold letters were the initials each. Evangeline was reviewing documents, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she made notes in the margins with a fountain pen. She was the kind of woman who commanded respect simply by existing. She didn't need to raise her voice or demand attention. People simply felt her presence and adjusted accordingly. But Evangeline's elegance and success hadn't come easily. She had built everything she had from nothing, clawing her way up through industries that had tried to keep her out at every turn. She had been underestimated, dismissed, and discriminated against more times than she could count. But she had never quit. She had turned every closed door into fuel, every insult into motivation. Now she sat at the helm of Hartwell Global Developments, one of the most successful commercial real estate development companies in the country. She was polite to everyone around her, nodding graciously at the other passengers, thanking the gate agent who had helped her find her seat. She noticed everything. The young mother struggling with a crying baby 2 rows back. The businessman already on his 3rd scotch before takeoff. The little girl in the purple dress with eyes that seemed to see right through the world's pretenses. Evangeline had no idea that in less than 2 hours, that little girl would save her life. And then there was Mariana Svensson. Mariana was 34 years old and had been a flight attendant for a decade. She wore her blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun that seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of mild disdain. Her features were sharp, angular, her blue eyes the color of ice on a winter lake. Cold, assessing, judgmental. She moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, her smile bright and warm for some passengers, noticeably absent for others. To the white couple in seats 3A and 3B, she was all charm and accommodation. She brought them extra pillows without being asked, made sure their drinks were refilled before they were empty, laughed at jokes that weren't funny. But when she passed Evangeline's row, her smile disappeared like someone had flipped a switch. Her movements became mechanical, perfunctory. Her tone shifted from warm to barely professional. Mariana had grown up in a small town in Minnesota where the population was 97% white and the unspoken rules were clear. Certain people belonged in certain places. Her father had owned the only hardware store in town, and she had learned young that you could say a lot without ever speaking the quiet parts out loud. You didn't have to use slurs or make scenes. You just had to make people feel unwelcome in small, deniable ways. A cold look, a slower service, a suggestion that they might be more comfortable somewhere else. Mariana had mastered this art over her 10 years in the air. She knew exactly how to discriminate with a smile. Nothing she did was ever quite dramatic enough to report. She never said anything explicitly racist. She just made her preferences known through 1,000 tiny actions, each one plausibly deniable, each one calculated to stay just beneath the threshold of what could be called out or recorded. Her seniority had made her comfortable, even entitled. She knew the routes, knew the regulations, knew exactly how far she could push before anyone would push back. And in her experience, most people didn't push back. They just swallowed the disrespect and moved on because fighting was exhausting and often futile. Mariana thought she had power. Up here at 45,000 feet, in this metal tube hurtling through the sky, she was the authority. She decided who got extra snacks, who got attitude, who deserved respect. She had no idea that her power was about to be shattered by an 8-year-old girl in a purple butterfly dress. She had no idea that every choice she made in the next 2 hours would be recorded, judged, and broadcast to millions. She had no idea that by the time this flight landed, her entire life would be over. The plane pushed back from the gate. The engines roared to life. And at 45,000 feet in the air, 4 lives were about to collide in a way that would change everything. If you believe that courage can come from the smallest among us, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is about to show you exactly what happens when an 8-year-old girl decides that enough is enough. Now, let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. Have you ever witnessed injustice happening right in front of you and felt frozen, unsure if you should speak up? Drop your answer in the comments below, because what happens next in the story might just change how you answer that question forever. The flight took off smoothly. Too smoothly. The kind of smooth that makes you forget you're hurtling through the sky in a metal tube, defying gravity at 45,000 feet. The engines settled into their steady hum, that white noise that lulls passengers into a false sense of normalcy. Seatbelt signs dinged off. People shifted in their seats, pulling out laptops and tablets and books. The businessman in 4C ordered his fourth scotch. The young mother finally got her baby to sleep. Everything seemed peaceful. But Blossom felt it. That prickling sensation on the back of her neck that told her something wasn't right. She had learned to trust that feeling. It was the same feeling she'd had in the mall 2 years ago, right before her mother collapsed. The calm before the storm. She watched Mariana move through the cabin, and what she saw made her stomach twist into knots. Mariana glided down the aisle with a beverage cart, and it was like watching someone perform a carefully choreographed dance of discrimination. To the white passengers, she was all warmth and generosity. She anticipated their needs before they even asked. The elderly white woman in 2B hadn't even finished her ginger ale before Mariana was there with a fresh one, complete with extra ice and a napkin. The young white couple in 5A and 5B received a basket of premium snacks, the kind that were supposed to cost extra, delivered with a conspiratorial wink and a whispered, "Don't tell anyone, but you two look like you could use a little treat." She laughed at their jokes. She complimented the woman's earrings. She made them feel special, seen, valued. But then she passed row 7, where an elderly black man sat reading a newspaper. He was dressed impeccably in a cardigan and slacks, his silver hair neatly combed. He looked up as Mariana approached and raised his hand politely. "Excuse me, miss. Could I trouble you for a cup of water when you get a moment?" Mariana's smile vanished like someone had wiped it off her face with a cloth. Her eyes went flat, her voice clipped and cold. "I'll get to you when I can." She didn't stop. She didn't even slow down. She just kept pushing her cart forward, leaving the man sitting there with his hands still partially raised, confusion and hurt flickering across his face before he carefully tucked it away behind a mask of dignity that came from years of practice. Blossom watched him lower his hands slowly. Watched him return to his newspaper, though she could tell he wasn't really reading anymore. The words on the page had become blurry, meaningless. He was just staring at them, trying to maintain his composure. 20 minutes passed. The elderly man never got his water. Mariana walked past him 4 more times with her cart, serving everyone around him, but never once acknowledging his presence. It was as if he had become invisible. Blossom felt her hands ball into fists on her armrest. She turned to her father, her voice urgent and angry. "Daddy, did you see that?" She didn't. Jadena placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. His touch was warm but firm, grounding. When she looked up at him, she saw something in his eyes that broke her heart a little. Resignation. Weariness. The tired acceptance of someone who had fought this battle 1,000 times and knew exactly how it would end. "Not now, sweetie," he said quietly. "Some battles aren't ours to fight today." Blossom wanted to argue. Her father had always taught her to stand up for what was right. He had told her stories about civil rights heroes, about people who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. He had raised her to believe that her voice mattered, that she had a responsibility to speak up when she saw something wrong. But he had also taught her to choose her moments wisely. To understand that sometimes speaking up could make things worse, not better. That sometimes you had to swallow your anger and your sense of justice because the consequences of fighting back were too steep. Blossom understood what he wasn't saying. They couldn't afford to make a scene. They couldn't risk getting kicked off this flight. Too much was riding on this trip. Her father's company. Their home. Their future. Everything hung in a delicate balance, and one wrong move could send it all crashing down. So she stayed quiet. But the frustration built inside her like pressure in a volcano. Her father had taught her to stand up for what was right, and yet here he was, telling her to stay silent. The contradiction tore at her. She understood his reasons. She understood the impossible position he was in. But understanding didn't make it hurt any less. She didn't know yet that staying quiet now would become impossible very soon. She didn't know that in less than an hour, the choice would be taken out of her hands entirely. That she would be faced with a decision that had nothing to do with calculations or consequences, but everything to do with life and death. The service officially began about 30 minutes into the flight. Mariana emerged from the galley pushing a cart laden with meal options and drinks, her professional smile fixed firmly in place. Blossom watched her like a hawk, her earlier frustration still simmering just beneath the surface. Mariana worked her way down the aisle, row by row. The performance continued. Warm and accommodating to some passengers, cold and perfunctory to others. The pattern was so clear, so blatant, that Blossom couldn't understand how everyone else wasn't seeing it. Then Mariana reached Evangeline's row. It was like watching someone flip a switch. The smile that had been plastered across Mariana's face just seconds earlier disappeared completely. Her body language shifted. Where she had been leaning in, engaging, making eye contact with the previous passengers, now she stood rigid and distant. Evangeline looked up from her documents with a polite smile. Her voice was kind, her tone gracious. "May I have the chicken wrap and a glass of wine, please?" It was a simple request. Polite. Reasonable. The kind of request Mariana had been fulfilling all morning for other passengers. But her response made Blossom's blood run cold. "We're out of chicken wraps. You can have pretzels." The tone was dismissive, final. Not apologetic. Not regretful. Just cold and matter-of-fact, as if Evangeline should have known better than to ask for something so presumptuous. But here's the thing. Blossom could see the cart from her seat. She had watched Mariana serve the previous passengers. She had seen the chicken wraps, at least 5 of them, wrapped in plastic and sitting right there in the cart. Visible. Available. Right there. Mariana was lying. Openly. Brazenly. And she didn't even have the decency to hide the evidence. Evangeline's expression didn't change. Not even a flicker. She simply nodded, her smile never wavering, though something in her eyes dimmed just slightly. "Pretzels are fine, thank you." Her voice remained kind. Gracious. She didn't challenge Mariana. Didn't point out the obvious lie. Didn't demand to speak to a supervisor. She just accepted the disrespect with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that fighting every battle would leave you with nothing but exhaustion and scars. Mariana handed her a small bag of pretzels and a plastic cup of water, no wine offered, and moved on without another word. Blossom's heart pounded in her chest. Her mind raced with confusion and anger. Why hadn't Evangeline said anything? Why had she just accepted it? Couldn't she see the chicken wraps right there in the cart? 2 rows later, Mariana stopped at a white passenger's seat, and suddenly the warmth was back. The smile. The accommodating tone. Everything that had been absent just moments before. "Good morning, sir. We have chicken wraps, turkey sandwiches, or fruit plates. What would you prefer?" The man barely looked up from his phone. "Chicken wrap is fine." "Excellent choice." Mariana beamed, pulling a chicken wrap from the cart, the same cart she had just claimed was empty of chicken wraps. "And can I get you something to drink? Wine, beer, juice, water?" Blossom couldn't contain herself anymore. She leaned close to her father, her whisper urgent and disbelieving. "Daddy," she said, "they were out." Jidenna had been staring out the window, trying to focus on his pitch for tomorrow's meetings, trying not to think about the humiliation he had just witnessed. But at his daughter's words, his jaw tightened. His expression hardened in a way Blossom rarely saw. "I saw, baby. I saw." Those 4 words carried the weight of a lifetime of similar moments. Jidenna had seen this exact scenario play out countless times in countless ways. In boardrooms where his ideas were dismissed until a white colleague repeated them verbatim. In banks where he was scrutinized 3 times as hard for loans he was more than qualified for. In restaurants where he was seated near the kitchen despite having reservations. In stores where security followed him through the aisles. He had seen it all. And he was tired. So desperately tired. But more than that, he was calculating. His mind was already running through the scenarios. What would happen if they spoke up? If they called Mariana out? If they demanded fair treatment? Best case scenario. Mariana would apologize insincerely, give Evangeline a chicken wrap, and spend the rest of the flight making their lives miserable in small, petty ways. Worst case scenario, she would accuse them of being disruptive. The captain would get involved. They could be removed from the flight. They could be banned from the airline. His meetings tomorrow would be missed. His last chance to save his company would evaporate. Was it worth it? Was this the hill to die on? Jidenna looked at the elegant woman 3 rows ahead, sitting with her pretzels and her quiet dignity, and he felt a kinship with her. A shared understanding. They were both playing by rules that weren't fair, rules that required them to be twice as good and expect half as much, rules that demanded they swallow their pride and their anger just to get through the day without losing everything they had worked so hard to build. So he stayed quiet. And he hated himself a little bit for it. But what Jidenna didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that by staying quiet now, he was setting the stage for something far more important. Sometimes the universe requires us to witness injustice before we're ready to fight against it. Sometimes we need to feel the weight of our own silence before we understand the true cost of our voice. Let me tell you more about Evangeline, because understanding her story makes what happens next even more powerful. Evangeline Hartwell had been traveling for 30 hours straight. She had flown from Los Angeles to Dubai 5 days earlier for a series of high-stakes meetings with international investors. The meetings had been brutal. 12-hour days of negotiations, presentations, defending every decision, proving her competence over and over again in a room full of men who assumed she was someone's assistant until she sat down at the head of the table. She was exhausted in a way that went bone deep. Her body ached. Her mind was fuzzy with jet lag. All she wanted was to get home, take a hot bath and sleep for approximately 18 hours. But even exhausted, even running on fumes, she maintained her dignity. She sat up straight. She kept her voice measured and polite. She didn't complain or make demands. Because Evangeline Hartwell had built her company, Hartwell Global Developments, from absolutely nothing. She had started 40 years ago with a single property, a rundown apartment building in a neighborhood that everyone else had written off. She had renovated it herself, learning plumbing and electrical work and carpentry because she couldn't afford to hire contractors. She had created affordable, beautiful housing in a community that had been neglected and forgotten. And she had faced discrimination at every single turn. Banks had refused her loans. Suppliers had inflated their prices. Inspectors had scrutinized her work with a magnifying glass, looking for any excuse to shut her down. She had been called every name imaginable. She had been threatened. She had been undermined and underestimated and dismissed. But she had never quit. She had turned every obstacle into a stepping stone. Every closed door into motivation. Every insult into fuel. And now, 4 decades later, she sat at the helm of a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars, with developments in 15 states and a reputation for integrity and excellence that was unshakable. She had earned every bit of her success through sheer force of will and an absolute refusal to let the world's cruelty break her spirit. But that didn't mean the cruelty didn't still hurt. It just meant she had gotten very, very good at not showing it. As Mariana moved away with her cart, Evangeline sat there with her bag of pretzels and her plastic cup of water, and for just a moment she allowed herself to feel the weight of it all. The exhaustion. The indignity. The constant, relentless requirement to prove herself worthy of basic human decency. She thought about when she was 8 years old, about Blossom's age. She remembered going to a diner with her parents after church one Sunday. They had waited to be seated while white families who came in after them were taken to tables immediately. Her father had kept his hand on her shoulder, firm and steady, and whispered the same words Jidenna had just spoken to Blossom. "Not today, baby girl. Some battles aren't ours to fight today." Young Evangeline had looked around that diner, searching the faces of the white patrons, desperately hoping that someone would speak up. Someone would say, "Excuse me, but this family was here first." Someone would acknowledge the injustice happening right in front of them. But no one had. They had all kept their eyes on their plates, on their conversations, on anything except the black family standing by the door, waiting for basic dignity. That memory had stayed with Evangeline for 54 years. She could still feel the weight of her father's hand on her shoulder. Could still taste the disappointment that had settled in her stomach like stones. She turned slightly in her seat, glancing back down the aisle. Her eyes landed on Blossom, who was staring directly at her with an expression of confused anger. Their eyes met, and Evangeline saw herself in that little girl's face. Saw the same sense of injustice, the same inability to understand why the adults around her were accepting something so clearly wrong. Evangeline gave her a small, sad smile. It was a smile that said, "Welcome to the world, little one. This is how it works. You'll get used to it eventually. You'll learn to swallow the anger and keep moving forward because that's what survival requires." But Blossom didn't smile back. Her jaw set with determination, her small hands gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned pale. And in that moment, Evangeline saw something she hadn't expected. She saw someone who wasn't going to accept it. Someone who wasn't going to get used to it. Someone who still believed that injustice should be fought, not endured. Evangeline turned back around, her smile fading. She felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, maybe. Or recognition. The understanding that perhaps the next generation wouldn't have to learn the same painful lessons of silence that her generation had. She opened her laptop, pulled out her bag of pretzels and tried to focus on the work in front of her. She had a major proposal due by the end of the week, contracts to review, emails to answer. Work was always the answer when the world became too much. Work was solid and measurable and within her control. 30 minutes into the flight, the cabin had settled into that quiet hum of people occupied with their own worlds. Evangeline worked steadily, typing notes with one hand while absently eating pretzels with the other. She reached for her plastic cup of water, took a sip to wash down the dry, salty snack. And then everything went wrong. A piece of pretzel, just the wrong size and the wrong shape, caught in her throat at the exact wrong angle. It wasn't huge. It shouldn't have been a problem. But it lodged itself in a way that made swallowing impossible, made breathing impossible. Evangeline's eyes went wide with sudden panic. She tried to cough but nothing came out. No air. No sound. Nothing. Her hand flew to her throat instinctively, fingers pressing against her neck as if she could somehow dislodge it from the outside. She tried to stand, her body's survival instinct taking over. Her knee hit the laptop, knocking it off the tray table. It clattered to the floor with a crash that made nearby passengers look up. Evangeline stood fully now, one hand still clutching her throat, the other reaching out as if she could grab onto something, anything that would help. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. No air. No sound. Just the terrible, overwhelming sensation of suffocation. Passengers around her began to notice. The man across the aisle half stood, his face confused and concerned. "Ma'am? Are you okay?" But Evangeline couldn't answer. Couldn't make a sound. She raised her other hand to her throat, making the universal sign for choking. Both hands wrapped around her neck, her eyes pleading, desperate. The woman in the window seat beside her gasped and jumped up. "Oh my God, she's choking." More heads turned. More people stood. But here's the thing about emergencies at 45,000 feet. There's nowhere to run. Number 911 to call. No hospital down the street. You're trapped in a pressurized metal tube with 200 other people, and help is either on this plane or it doesn't exist. Evangeline's face was beginning to change color. The healthy brown of her skin taking on a grayish tinge. Her eyes were wide with terror, tears streaming down her cheeks. She stumbled into the aisle, her legs beginning to weaken. A white passenger in the row behind her called out urgently, "Flight attendant, we need help here. Medical emergency." And here's where everything that had happened before suddenly mattered. Here's where the pattern of Mariana's behavior, the casual cruelty she had displayed, came to a head in the most devastating way possible. Because at 45,000 feet in the air, with a woman choking and dying right in front of her, Mariana Svensson was about to make a choice that would destroy her life and save another's. And 8-year-old Blossom, sitting 3 rows back with her hands gripping the armrest and her mother's last moments flashing before her eyes, was about to discover exactly how much courage she had. If this story is reminding you why we can never stay silent in the face of injustice, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will show you exactly what one brave little girl can do when the adults around her fail to act. Now let me ask you something, and I really want you to think about this and answer honestly in the comments. If you were on that plane right now watching a woman choke while others stood frozen, what would you do? Would you spring into action or would fear hold you back? Because in 60 seconds, Blossom is about to show us what real courage looks like. Evangeline stumbled into the aisle, her elegant composure completely shattered. Her hands were still wrapped around her throat, her fingers digging into her own skin as if she could somehow create an opening for air that wouldn't come. Her face was turning red now, a deep, alarming crimson that spoke of oxygen deprivation and mounting panic. The cream suit that had looked so pristine just minutes ago was now wrinkled and askew, her silver locks falling forward across her face as she bent over, trying desperately to force her body to cough, to breathe, to do anything except this terrible, suffocating nothing. A white passenger 2 rows back, a businessman who had been absorbed in his laptop, looked up and immediately understood what was happening. He shot to his feet, his voice sharp with urgency. "Flight attendant. Medical emergency. Someone's choking." The words cut through the cabin like a knife. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. That collective intake of breath that happens when people realize something terrible is unfolding right in front of them. Mariana appeared from the galley, summoned by the shout. She stepped into the aisle, her eyes landing on Evangeline, who was now doubled over, one hand braced against a seat back to keep herself upright, the other still clutching her throat. And here's what happened next. And I need you to really understand this because what Mariana did in this moment revealed everything about who she was as a person. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She saw Evangeline. She understood immediately what was happening. The signs were unmistakable. The universal choking gesture. The inability to make sound. The color draining and then flooding back into the face. The panic. The desperation. Mariana knew exactly what was happening. And then there was a calculation. You could see it pass across her face like a shadow. A decision being made in real time. A choice between her humanity and something darker, something that had been festering inside her for so long it had become part of her identity. She straightened her shoulders, smoothed down her uniform, and called out in a voice that was sharp and authoritative. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. You're blocking the aisle." The cabin went silent. Not the silence of people holding their breath in anticipation, but the silence of complete, stunned disbelief. Several passengers actually turned to look at each other as if to confirm they had heard what they thought they heard. A woman choking. Clearly visibly choking. And the flight attendant was telling her to sit down. Another passenger, a middle-aged white woman with short gray hair, stood up, her voice rising in disbelief and anger. "She's choking. She needs help." Mariana turned to face the woman, and her expression was something that would haunt everyone who saw it. It was false concern, performed with the skill of someone who had been wearing masks her entire life. Her voice dripped with a sickly sweet condescension. "I'm sure she's fine. Some people are just dramatic for attention." The words hung in the air like poison. Some people. Everyone in that cabin knew exactly what she meant by some people. There was no ambiguity. No room for interpretation. And then Mariana did something that proved she understood exactly how serious this was. She turned to walk away. Not to get help. Not to call for medical assistance. Not to grab water or the first aid kit or anything that might save a human life. She simply turned her back on a dying woman and started to walk back toward the galley. The collective shock in the cabin was palpable. Passengers were looking at each other with expressions of horror and confusion. Did she really just say that? Did she really just walk away? This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. But it was real. And Evangeline's body was shutting down. Her knees buckled slightly, her legs no longer able to hold her full weight. She grabbed onto the seat beside her with both hands now, no longer able to maintain the choking gesture, just trying to stay upright as her vision began to tunnel and darken at the edges. The panic in her eyes was raw and primal. "This is how I die," those eyes said. At 45,000 feet, choking on a pretzel while a flight attendant walks away. And that's when Blossom moved. She didn't think about it, didn't calculate the risks or weigh the consequences. Her mother's face flashed before her eyes. Her mother, gasping for air on that cold mall floor while people walked past. Her mother, dying while everyone assumed someone else would help. Her mother, whose last moments were filled with the terrible knowledge that the world had looked at her and decided she wasn't worth the inconvenience of stopping. Blossom's small hands flew to her seatbelt, fumbling with the buckle. She yanked it open and jumped into the aisle, her purple butterfly dress swirling around her legs. Miss, she needs water. She's choking." Her voice was high and desperate, cutting through the shocked murmurs of the other passengers. She ran toward Mariana, her small legs carrying her as fast as they could. Mariana stopped, turned slowly and looked down at Blossom. Her expression was one of barely concealed annoyance, the look an adult gives a child who has interrupted something important with something trivial. "Little girl, go back to your seat. This is adult business." The dismissiveness in her voice was absolute. She had reduced Blossom to nothing more than a nuisance, an interruption to be dealt with and dismissed. But Blossom had seen Evangeline's face, had seen the terror, had seen death creeping in at the edges. She planted her small feet firmly and raised her voice. "But she needs help right now." Mariana's eyes narrowed. She bent down, lowering herself to Blossom's height, and when she spoke, her voice was low and threatening, meant only for the child's ears. "If you don't sit down immediately, I'll have to speak to your father about your behavior. You don't want to cause problems, do you?" It was a calculated move, and Mariana knew exactly what she was doing. She had seen this tactic work 1,000 times before. Threaten the child with consequences to their parent. Activate the child's fear of getting their father in trouble. Make them complicit in their own silence. Discipline the child and the father won't intervene. Keep control. Maintain order. Protect her authority at all costs. Behind Blossom, Jidenna had risen from his seat. He stood in the aisle now, tall and imposing, but his face showed the terrible conflict raging inside him. He looked at his daughter, so small and brave and determined. He looked at Evangeline, now barely conscious, her body slowly sliding down toward the floor. He looked at Mariana, her mask of authority firmly in place. And he thought about tomorrow's meetings. About the investors who held his company's future in their hands. About the 3 months of operating funds he had left. About the promise he made to his dying wife. About whether making a scene on this airplane would be the final domino that sent everything crashing down. He moved forward and placed a gentle hand on Blossom's shoulder. His voice was soft, almost pleading. "Come on, sweetheart. I'm sure they'll handle it." But Blossom resisted, her small body rigid with determination. Because in her mind she wasn't on an airplane anymore. She was back in that mall, 8 years old, watching her mother die while people did nothing. She was feeling that helplessness again, that suffocating sense of being too small, too powerless, too young to make a difference. But she wasn't in that mall anymore. She was here. And this time she wasn't going to let someone die while she did nothing. She pulled away from her father's hand and turned back to Mariana. "She's going to die. Please." That's when another passenger intervened. An older white man, probably in his 70s, with white hair and a face lined with decades of life experience. He stood up from his seat with the creaking slowness of arthritic joints, but his voice was strong and commanding. "For God's sake, get this woman some water and do the Heimlich." His authority was different from Mariana's. His was earned through years, through the automatic respect society grants to elderly white men. And Mariana, who had been so dismissive of Evangeline and so threatening to Blossom, now had to respond to someone she couldn't simply ignore. But instead of backing down, instead of acknowledging the emergency, Mariana's mask slipped entirely. The false professionalism evaporated, and what emerged was ugly and raw and undeniable. "Sir, I'm trained for these situations." Her voice was sharp, defensive. "She's exaggerating. Some people do this for lawsuits." The accusation hung in the air like a slap. She was accusing a choking woman, a woman literally dying in front of dozens of witnesses, of faking it for money. The racism wasn't subtle anymore. It wasn't hidden behind professional language or plausible deniability. It was right there, naked and vicious. Evangeline was on her knees now, both hands pressed flat against the carpet, her head hanging down as if she could somehow force gravity to dislodge the obstruction. Tears streamed down her face, not tears of sadness but tears of biological response, her body's automatic reaction to oxygen deprivation. Her skin tone had changed to a frightening shade, a grayish purple that made her look like she was already halfway to death. The narrator needs you to understand something crucial here. Time moves differently in emergencies. Every second stretches into an eternity when you're watching someone die. At 45,000 feet, with no hospital, no emergency room, no paramedics coming, every second that passed was another second closer to irreversible brain damage. Another second closer to death. And Mariana was letting those seconds tick by with deliberate, calculated slowness. Blossom was screaming now, her small voice breaking with desperation. "She's not exaggerating. Look at her. Please." Other passengers were standing now, their voices rising in a chorus of anger and disbelief. Someone shouted for the captain. Someone else was trying to find the emergency call button. The cabin was erupting into chaos, but at the center of it all was Mariana, standing firm in her conviction that she was right, that she was in control, that this woman was not worth saving. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 30 seconds, Mariana made a show of sighing heavily, as if she was being incredibly put upon by these unreasonable passengers. She walked slowly, deliberately toward the galley. Not running. Not hurrying. Just walking at a leisurely pace while a woman died behind her. She returned carrying a tiny plastic cup, the kind airlines use for medicine or mouthwash. It held maybe 2 ounces of water, barely enough to wet someone's mouth, certainly not enough to help someone who was choking. But she didn't bring it to Evangeline. She just stood there, several feet away, holding the cup in one hand, her other hand on her hip. If she wants it, she can come get it herself. The cabin exploded. Passengers were shouting now, real anger in their voices. Someone yelled, "What is wrong with you?" Another voice shouted, "Give her the water." A woman started crying, her hands over her mouth in horror. But Mariana stood her ground, her face set in stubborn defiance. "I will not be bullied by passengers. This woman is disrupting the flight. This woman. Not even a name. Not even the basic dignity of personhood. Just, this woman, as if Evangeline was an object, an inconvenience, a problem to be managed rather than a human being fighting for her life. This was the moment Mariana sealed her fate. Every word she spoke, every second she delayed, every ounce of cruelty she displayed was being seared into the memories of dozens of witnesses. Several passengers had their phones out now, recording. The evidence was mounting. The witnesses were multiplying. And Mariana, in her arrogance and her certainty that she held the power here, had no idea that she had just destroyed herself. Evangeline collapsed fully now. Not a controlled lowering but a complete loss of consciousness. Her body simply gave out, crumpling to the floor like a puppet with cut strings. She lay there on the industrial carpet, her silver locks spread around her head like a halo, her cream suit now stained and wrinkled, her chest barely moving with shallow, desperate attempts at breath. Her consciousness was fading, darkness creeping in at the edges of her vision. Her last thoughts were of her late husband, of the company she had built, of the life she had lived. This is how it ends, she thought. Not in bed surrounded by loved ones, not after a long life well lived, but on the floor of an airplane, choking on a pretzel while a flight attendant watches with contempt. And Blossom saw it all. Saw Evangeline's face, and in that face she saw her mother. The same desperate need for air. The same terror. The same loneliness of dying while the world watches and does nothing. Something inside Blossom snapped. Not broke but transformed. Like a butterfly breaking out of its chrysalis, violent and necessary and irreversible. All the fear, all the calculation, all the worry about consequences and repercussions and making things worse, it all burned away in an instant, leaving only pure, crystalline clarity. Someone was dying. She could help. Nothing else mattered. The narrator wants you to see this moment in slow motion, because this was the moment that changed everything. Blossom's small legs began to move, her feet pounding against the airplane carpet. Her purple dress billowed behind her like wings, those hand-sewn butterflies seeming to flutter and come alive. Her bright eyes were fixed on that tiny plastic cup in Mariana's hand, filled with water that could save a life. She ran toward Mariana with single-minded determination. This woman, this adult, this person of authority towered above her. Mariana was 5 feet 8 inches tall. Blossom was 4 feet nothing. Mariana outweighed her by 100 pounds. Mariana had power and authority and a uniform that commanded respect. But Blossom had something more powerful. She had courage born of loss. She had determination forged in grief. She had a promise she had made beside her mother's hospital bed, a promise that she would never, ever stand by and watch someone die without doing everything in her power to help. Blossom jumped. Her small body left the ground, both arms reaching upward with perfect focus. Her hands closed around that plastic cup, wrapping around Mariana's larger hand, and she pulled with every ounce of strength in her small body. The cup came free. Water splashed everywhere, droplets catching the overhead lights like diamonds. Some of it hit Mariana's pristine uniform, dark spots spreading across the fabric. Some of it hit the floor. But most of it stayed in the cup, held tightly in Blossom's small hands. Mariana gasped, her eyes wide with shock and outrage. "You little?" But Blossom was already gone, already running, already dropping to her knees beside Evangeline's unconscious form. The cup trembled in her hands, water sloshing against the sides, but she held it steady, so steady, with the same determination her grandmother had used when she sewed those butterflies onto purple fabric. "Drink. Please drink." Blossom pressed the cup to Evangeline's lips, tilting it gently. Evangeline's eyes fluttered open, barely conscious, barely aware. The cool water touched her lips, and some instinct, some deep survival reflex, made her try to swallow. And that's when another passenger arrived. A man in his 40s who had been sitting in row 10, who happened to be an EMT in his day job, who had been trying to push through the crowd of standing passengers. He dropped to his knees on the other side of Evangeline, his trained hands immediately assessing the situation. "I've got her," he said to Blossom, his voice calm and professional. "You did good, sweetheart. You did so good." He positioned Evangeline correctly, tilting her forward, one hand supporting her chest, the other positioned between her shoulder blades. He delivered 5 sharp back blows, precise and controlled, each one designed to create enough force to dislodge an obstruction without causing injury. The combination of the water, the positioning, and the back blows worked together. On the third blow, Evangeline's body convulsed. Her throat spasmed. And the piece of pretzel that had been lodged there, that had been stealing her air and her life, came flying out of her mouth and landed on the carpet. Evangeline coughed violently, her whole body shaking with the force of it. And then she gasped, and the most beautiful sound in the world filled that cabin. The sound of air rushing into lungs that had been starving for it. The sound of life returning. The sound of survival. She gasped again and again, each breath ragged and desperate and absolutely precious. Tears streamed down her face as her body remembered how to breathe, as oxygen flooded back into her system, as the darkness that had been closing in retreated. The cabin erupted in applause and relief. People were crying. People were cheering. Strangers were hugging strangers. The collective tension that had been building, the horror of watching someone die, released all at once in a wave of pure, joyous relief. The EMT helped Evangeline sit up against the seat, keeping her steady as her body recovered from the trauma. Someone handed him a bottle of water, proper water this time, and he helped her take small, careful sips. And through it all, Blossom knelt beside her, still holding that tiny plastic cup in both hands, her purple dress pooled around her knees, her face streaked with tears she hadn't even realized she was crying. Evangeline turned her head slowly, her movements still shaky, and looked at the little girl beside her. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something passed between them that had no words. Gratitude. Recognition. The bond between someone who saves a life and someone whose life was saved. Blossom had just saved a life. At 8 years old, she had looked at an impossible situation, at adults who were failing to act, at authority figures who were actively harmful, and she had decided that none of that mattered more than doing the right thing. But Blossom had no idea that she had saved more than just Evangeline's life. She had no idea that in that tiny plastic cup of water, in that moment of pure courage, she had also saved her father's future. She had no idea that the woman whose life she had just saved was about to change everything for her family. And Mariana, standing a few feet away with water stains on her uniform and shock written across her face, had no idea that her life as she knew it was over. That every cruel word, every calculated delay, every moment of her racism and contempt had been witnessed, recorded, and would soon be judged by millions. At 45,000 feet in the air, an 8-year-old girl in a purple butterfly dress had just proved that courage doesn't require size or age or authority. It just requires the willingness to do what's right, even when everyone else is frozen in fear or calculation or cruelty. If Blossom's courage just gave you chills, if you believe that sometimes the smallest person in the room can be the bravest, then hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is about to show you exactly what happens when that courage gets rewarded in ways no one saw coming. Now I need to know, have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between staying safe and doing the right thing? What did you choose, and do you regret it? Drop your answer in the comments below, because what happens next is going to make you think about that choice in a whole new way. Mariana's face was bright red, but it wasn't from exertion or concern or relief that a passenger's life had just been saved. It was rage. Pure, undiluted rage mixed with humiliation so thick you could taste it in the air around her. Her carefully constructed mask of professionalism, the one that had been slipping throughout the flight, shattered completely. She stood there with water stains spreading across her uniform, watching passengers applaud an 8-year-old girl, watching them comfort and praise a woman she had dismissed and dehumanized, and something inside her snapped in the ugliest possible way. Her voice came out shrill and sharp, cutting through the applause like a knife. That child assaulted me. She grabbed company property and destroyed my uniform. The applause died immediately. Passengers turned to stare at her with expressions of disbelief. Surely they hadn't heard her correctly. Surely a flight attendant hadn't just accused a child of assault for saving someone's life. But Mariana wasn't done. She stormed forward, her movements jerky with anger, and before anyone could react, she grabbed Blossom's arm. Her fingers wrapped around the small girl's bicep, squeezing hard enough to leave marks, hard enough to make Blossom gasp in pain and surprise. "Your father is going to pay for this." Mariana's voice was venomous, her face twisted with an emotion that went far beyond professional concern. This was personal. This was about power and control and the absolute audacity of this child, this black child, defying her authority and making her look foolish in front of all these passengers. Jidenna moved faster than anyone had seen him move all flight. One moment he was kneeling beside Evangeline, the next he was standing at full height, his considerable frame suddenly imposing, his voice dropping to a tone that was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. "Take your hands off my daughter. Now." There was no yelling. No theatrics. Just 5 words delivered with such controlled fury that several passengers actually took a step back. This was a man who had spent his entire adult life swallowing disrespect, accepting indignities, staying quiet to keep the peace. But put your hands on his child, hurt his baby girl, and all that restraint evaporated like water on hot asphalt. Mariana looked up at him, and for just a second, genuine fear flickered across her face. She was confronting a man who had been pushed past his breaking point, and some primal part of her brain recognized the danger. But her pride, her absolute conviction in her own righteousness, overrode that fear. She released Blossom's arm but didn't back down. Instead, she drew herself up to her full height, pointing an accusatory finger at Jidenna. "She's out of control. You people need to learn respect." The cabin went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop from the cockpit to the tail. Every passenger, every single person on that plane heard those two words. You people. Not you and your daughter. Not your family. You people. Two words that revealed everything. Two words that stripped away any remaining doubt about what had been motivating Mariana's behavior throughout this entire flight. Two words that made explicit what had been implicit in every interaction, every dismissal, every cruel decision she had made. The racism was no longer hidden behind professional language or plausible deniability. It was right there, naked and undeniable, witnessed by 200 people at 45,000 feet in the air. And here's what Mariana didn't notice in her rage and humiliation. Here's what she was too blinded by her own sense of victimhood to see. All around her, passengers had their phones out. Not to text or browse or play games. They were filming, recording, capturing every word that came out of her mouth, every expression that crossed her face, every gesture she made. The evidence was being created in real time, documented from multiple angles, time-stamped and geotagged and ready to be shared with the world. One passenger, a young woman with purple hair and an iPhone, was already live-streaming to her 50,000 followers. The comments were flooding in, viewers expressing shock and outrage, sharing the stream, tagging news outlets and civil rights organizations. Another passenger, an older man with steady hands and years of documentary photography experience, was recording in 4K, his professional instincts telling him this was important. This needed to be preserved with clarity and precision. A teenage boy in the back was already uploading clips to TikTok, his caption reading, "Flight attendant refuses to help choking woman, then attacks child who saved her. This is insane." Within minutes, the video would have 10,000 views. Within an hour, 1,000,000. But Mariana saw none of this. She was too focused on her wounded pride, too consumed by her need to reassert control. Evangeline, still sitting on the floor with the EMT beside her, her voice hoarse and raspy from the trauma her throat had just endured, spoke up. Each word clearly caused her pain, but she forced them out anyway. "Let the child go. She saved my life." It should have ended there. That simple statement from the person whose life had been saved should have been enough to defuse the situation, to make Mariana realize she was on the wrong side of this confrontation in every possible way. But Mariana didn't even acknowledge Evangeline's words. She kept her eyes fixed on Jidenna, her finger still pointing at him accusingly. "I'm making a report. This family will be banned from this airline. You'll never fly with us again." She spun on her heel and stormed toward the front of the plane, her footsteps heavy with self-righteous anger. She grabbed the phone in the galley, the one that connected directly to the cockpit, and began speaking in urgent, heated tones. "The narrator needs you to understand something critical about this moment." Mariana thought she had the power. She genuinely believed that she could use her authority as a flight attendant, her position within the airline's hierarchy, to punish this family for the crime of making her look bad. She thought the system would protect her the way it had always protected her before. She thought wrong. What Mariana had just done was make a catastrophic miscalculation. She had revealed her true nature in front of hundreds of witnesses and dozens of cameras. She had put her hands on a child who had saved someone's life. She had used explicitly racist language. And she had done all of this while that child's act of heroism was still fresh in everyone's minds, while the woman whose life had been saved was still sitting on the floor recovering, while the evidence of her cruelty and negligence was still visible to everyone in that cabin. Mariana had just handed every lawyer, every news outlet, every social media influencer, and every civil rights organization a gift-wrapped case of such clear-cut discrimination and misconduct that it would become a textbook example for years to come. But in that moment, storming to the front of the plane with water stains on her uniform and rage burning in her chest, Mariana had no idea that her life as she knew it was already over. Back in the aisle, Evangeline was slowly getting to her feet with the EMT's help. Her legs were shaky, her body still recovering from the trauma of oxygen deprivation, but she was determined to stand. She looked at Blossom, who stood beside her father, small and uncertain now that the adrenaline was fading, her arm still red where Mariana had grabbed her. Evangeline's voice was soft but clear. "Will you sit with me for a moment, brave girl?" Blossom looked up at her father, seeking permission. Jidenna nodded, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Together they helped Evangeline back to her seat. The EMT stayed close, monitoring her breathing and color, making sure she was truly stable. Evangeline settled into her seat with a wince, her body aching from the ordeal. She looked at Blossom, who stood in the aisle beside her, those bright eyes still full of concern. "What's your name, brave girl?" Blossom's voice was quiet, shy now in a way she hadn't been when she was fighting to save a life. "Blossom. Blossom Okafor." Evangeline smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her elegant features into something warm and maternal. "That's a beautiful name. I'm Evangeline. You saved my life, Blossom." The simple words carried immense weight. Blossom had heard people thank her in the chaos after the emergency, heard the applause and the praise, but this was different. This was the person whose life had been saved, looking directly into her eyes and acknowledging what she had done. Blossom's eyes filled with tears, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My mama died because nobody helped her in time. I wasn't going to let that happen to you." The narrator wants you to understand what happened in Evangeline's heart at that moment. It broke. It shattered into 1,000 pieces as she realized that this child, this precious, brave 8-year-old, had been carrying the weight of her mother's death for 2 years. Had turned that tragedy into a determination to never let another person suffer the same fate. Had been shaped by loss into someone who would risk everything to help a stranger. But even as Evangeline's heart broke, it also mended. Because she saw, in this small girl with butterflies on her dress and courage in her soul, proof that the next generation would be better. That they would be braver. That they would refuse to accept the cruelty and indifference that her generation had learned to endure. Tears spilled down Evangeline's cheeks, mixing with the ones already there from choking. She reached out and took Blossom's small hand in both of hers. "I'm so sorry about your mama, sweetheart. She would be so proud of you. So incredibly proud." She looked up at Jidenna, who was standing behind his daughter with his hand on her shoulder, his own eyes suspiciously bright with unshed tears. "You've raised an extraordinary daughter." Jidenna's voice was thick with emotion when he responded, pride and worry mixing together in equal measure. "Thank you. I'm sorry if we caused any trouble. We're heading to LA for business meetings and I'm worried this incident might." He trailed off, unable to articulate all his fears. That they would be banned from the airline and miss the meetings. That word would spread and the investors would hear about a disturbance and decide he wasn't worth the risk. That his last chance to save his company had just evaporated because his daughter had done the right thing. Evangeline heard all the unspoken fears in his silence. She squeezed Blossom's hand once more before releasing it, then looked up at Jidenna with new interest. "What kind of business?" Jidenna hesitated. Part of him wanted to change the subject, to not burden this woman who had just survived a near-death experience with his problems. But something in her eyes, a genuine interest and concern, made him answer honestly. "I own a construction company. Okafor & Sons. We specialize in sustainable commercial developments. Green building practices, energy efficiency, community-focused design. I'm heading to LA to pitch to some potential investors. The company's been struggling lately, and this trip is kind of my last shot at keeping it afloat." He said it simply without self-pity, just stating the facts. But Evangeline heard everything he didn't say. The years of work that had gone into building that company. The dreams he had invested in it. The weight of trying to provide for his daughter while honoring his late wife's memory. The exhaustion of constantly proving himself in an industry that questioned his competence at every turn. Her eyes lit up with recognition and something else. Something that looked almost like fate clicking into place. She leaned forward slightly, her voice growing stronger despite the rawness in her throat. "Tell me more. What kind of projects have you worked on? What's your vision for sustainable development?" Jidenna was surprised by the intensity of her interest, but he answered, his voice growing more animated as he talked about the thing he loved. He told her about the mixed-use development he had built in Atlanta, combining affordable housing with green space and small business retail. About his philosophy that construction should serve communities, not just investors. About his dream of proving that you could build profitably while also building responsibly. He told her about the contracts he had lost, careful not to sound bitter, just factual. About how companies with connections kept winning bids even when his proposals were objectively better. About the 3 months of operating funds he had left, the skeleton crew he was running, the office lease he wasn't sure he could renew. Evangeline listened to every word, nodding occasionally, asking pointed questions that revealed she understood the industry at a deep level. She asked about his team, his process, his suppliers, his safety record. She asked about his challenges with securing financing, with navigating permit processes, with managing cash flow during long projects. Jidenna answered everything honestly because at this point, what did he have to lose? This woman had just survived choking because of his daughter. She was being kind enough to show interest in his struggling business. The least he could do was be truthful. Finally, Evangeline sat back in her seat, her silver locks falling over her shoulder, and smiled. It was a smile that contained knowledge and decision and possibility. Mr. Okafor, I'm the CEO of Hartwell Global Developments. We're about to break ground on a $200 million mixed-use development in downtown Los Angeles. Time seemed to stop. Jidenna's eyes widened, his brain struggling to process what he had just heard. His mouth opened but no sound came out. Blossom looked up at her father, confused by his sudden stillness. You're Evangeline Hartwell? His voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Evangeline Hartwell was a legend in commercial development. Her company was one of the most successful in the country, known for projects that were both profitable and socially responsible. She was in Forbes magazine. She had been profiled in the New York Times. She gave keynote speeches at industry conferences that people paid thousands of dollars to attend. And she was sitting right here on this airplane because his daughter had saved her life. I've heard of your company, Jidenna continued, finding his voice. You're one of the most successful developers in the country. Your project in Chicago, the one that revitalized that whole neighborhood while keeping the original residents there, that was revolutionary. I studied it in. He stopped himself, realizing he was babbling like a starstruck college student. But Evangeline's smile only grew wider. We've been looking for a construction partner for the LA project. Someone with integrity, vision, and values that align with ours. She paused, her eyes moving from Jidenna to Blossom and back again. Someone who raises their children to do the right thing even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. She reached into her bag, moving slowly because her body was still recovering, and pulled out a leather business card holder. She extracted a card and held it out to Jidenna. Come to my office tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock. We need to talk about a contract. Jidenna took the card with trembling fingers. The paper was heavy, expensive, embossed with gold lettering. Evangeline Hartwell, CEO, Hartwell Global Developments. An address in downtown Los Angeles. A direct phone number. I don't know what to say. Evangeline reached out and patted his hand, her touch gentle but firm. Say you'll be there. And bring your portfolio and your proposal for sustainable construction practices. I want to see everything. At 45,000 feet in the air, a little girl's courage had just lifted her father's dreams even higher than the plane was flying. The contract that Jidenna had been desperately hoping to pitch to small-time investors, the business he had been fighting to save with his last 3 months of operating funds, had just been offered a lifeline by one of the most successful developers in the country. All because Blossom had seen someone who needed help and decided that nothing else mattered more than saving a life. Jidenna was speechless, tears openly streaming down his face now. He looked down at his daughter, who was beaming up at him with a smile that could light up the entire cabin. She didn't fully understand what had just happened, didn't grasp the significance of this moment, but she understood that something good had come from doing the right thing. Blossom had learned that lesson in the worst possible way, watching her mother die because no one helped. But now she was learning something new. She was learning that courage could be rewarded. That doing the right thing, even when it was hard, even when it was scary, even when there were consequences, could lead to something beautiful. Evangeline looked at the two of them, father and daughter, bound together by love and loss and now by hope, and felt a sense of rightness settle over her. She had almost died today. But she hadn't. And now she had the opportunity to change these people's lives in a meaningful way, to reward the kind of integrity and courage that the business world so desperately needed. This wasn't charity. This wasn't a feel-good gesture. Evangeline had asked pointed questions about Jidenna's company because she needed to know if he was truly qualified. And everything he had said, every answer he had given, had confirmed what she had already suspected from watching him parent his daughter. This was a man of principle, skill, and vision. This was exactly the kind of partner she had been looking for. But the story wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Because at the front of the plane, Mariana was still on the phone, still making her case to the captain, still convinced that she could control the narrative and punish this family for embarrassing her. And in the cockpit, Captain Obi Nwosu was listening to Mariana's report with growing disbelief and anger. She had been reviewing the passenger videos that crew members were discreetly forwarding to her tablet. She had heard from multiple flight attendants about what had happened. And she was about to make some decisions that would ensure justice was served at 45,000 feet. If you believe that doing the right thing should be rewarded and that cruelty should have consequences, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next is going to restore your faith that justice still exists in this world. Now I need to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed an act of courage that changed someone's life in an unexpected way? Share your story in the comments below, because Blossom's story is about to show us that sometimes the smallest act of bravery can have the biggest impact. The cockpit door opened with a decisive click that cut through the murmur of conversations in the cabin. Every head turned toward the front of the plane as a figure emerged, her presence commanding immediate attention even before anyone registered who she was. Captain Obi Nwosu stood in the doorway between the cockpit and the cabin, and she was a sight to behold. She was a black woman in her early 50s, her captain's uniform crisp and immaculate, 4 gold stripes on her shoulders gleaming under the cabin lights. Her hair was natural, cut short and elegant, framing a face that carried the kind of authority that came from 3 decades of flying, from thousands of hours in the air, from navigating storms both meteorological and human with unwavering skill and integrity. She had been informed of the entire incident. Her co-pilot had alerted her the moment the emergency began, and she had been monitoring the situation through crew communications while maintaining her primary responsibility of flying the aircraft. But once the plane reached cruising altitude and autopilot was engaged, she had taken the time to review everything that had happened. Flight attendants had discreetly forwarded passenger videos to her tablet. Multiple crew members had provided statements. She had watched, with growing horror and fury, as Mariana dismissed a choking passenger, threatened a child, used explicitly racist language, and put her hands on an 8-year-old girl who had just saved someone's life. Captain Obi had seen a lot in her 30 years of flying. She had dealt with drunk passengers, medical emergencies, mechanical failures, and every kind of human drama imaginable. But in all those years, in all those flights, she had never been more disgusted by the behavior of one of her crew members. She walked down the aisle with measured steps, her eyes scanning the cabin. She saw Evangeline, still pale but recovering, sitting in her seat with Blossom and Jadena nearby. She saw the passengers, some still recording, some watching with anticipation, all of them waiting to see what would happen next. And she saw Mariana at the front of the cabin, still on the phone, still filing her complaint, still operating under the delusion that she could control this situation. Captain Obi's voice carried the full weight of her authority when she spoke. "Mariana, I need you in the galley. Now." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order delivered by the person who held absolute authority on this aircraft, the person whose word was literally law at 45,000 feet. Mariana looked up, and for just a moment relief flooded her face. Finally, someone in authority who would listen to her side, who would understand that she had been disrespected and assaulted, who would validate her victimhood and punish this family for their audacity. She hung up the phone and followed Captain Obi into the galley. The curtain was pulled closed behind them, giving them privacy from the passengers but not from the flight attendants who stood nearby, witnessing everything. Behind that curtain, Captain Obi turned to face Mariana, and her expression was carved from stone and ice. When she spoke, her voice was low and controlled, but it carried more fury than any amount of shouting could have conveyed. In 30 years of flying, I've never been more disgusted by the behavior of a crew member. I saw the videos. I heard the testimonies. I know exactly what you did and exactly why you did it. Mariana's face, which had been set in lines of righteous indignation, began to falter. Something in Captain Obi's tone, in her expression, told her this wasn't going to go the way she had expected. "That child was out of control," Mariana began, her voice taking on a whining, defensive quality. Captain Obi cut her off with a slash of her hand through the air. "That child saved a passenger's life while you stood by and let a woman choke because of the color of her skin. You denied her service. You refused her help. You accused her of faking a medical emergency. And when an 8-year-old girl had the courage to do what you wouldn't, you assaulted her and used racist language in front of 200 witnesses." Each accusation landed like a physical blow. Mariana's face went from red to white, her mouth opening and closing without sound. "You're done," Captain Obi continued, her voice flat and final. "You're suspended immediately, effective this moment. You are no longer acting in any capacity as a member of this crew." Mariana found her voice and it came out shrill with panic. "You can't fire me mid-flight. I have union protection. I have seniority. You can't just." Captain Obi stepped closer, and despite being several inches shorter than Mariana, she seemed to tower over her. "Watch me. I am the captain of this aircraft, and I have the authority to remove any crew member who poses a threat to passenger safety or who violates the basic standards of human decency. You are both. When we land, airport security will be waiting. They will escort you off this plane before any passengers disembark. Don't bother packing your personal items. They'll be shipped to you. Mariana's face crumpled. The reality of what was happening finally breaking through her armor of denial and justification. But I was just, she grabbed company property. She saved a woman's life, Captain Obi said, her voice dropping to something that was almost a whisper but somehow more powerful than any shout. That little girl did what you should have done. What you were trained to do. What every decent human being would have done. And instead of showing even a shred of gratitude or humanity, you attacked her. You put your hands on a child. You used racist language. You revealed exactly who you are, and the world saw it. She pulled out her phone, showing Mariana the screen. On it was a video that had already been viewed 3 million times. It showed Mariana standing with a cup of water, saying, if she wants it, she can come get it herself, while Evangeline collapsed in the background. The comments below were a flood of outrage and disgust. This is already viral. Your name is already out there. By the time we land, every major news outlet will be covering this story. The airline will have no choice but to terminate you, not just suspend you. Your career in aviation is over. You did this to yourself. Mariana stared at the phone screen, watching herself through the eyes of millions of strangers, and finally she understood. Her legs gave out and she had to grab the counter to keep from collapsing. Captain Obi turned away from her, her disgust too complete for any further words. She pulled back the curtain and gestured to 2 other flight attendants. Escort her to the back of the plane. She's to have no further contact with passengers. She's suspended pending termination. The 2 flight attendants, both of whom had been horrified by Mariana's behavior, stepped forward without hesitation. They led Mariana, stumbling and shell-shocked, toward the rear of the aircraft. Passengers watched her pass and the silence was deafening. No one applauded. No one jeered. They just watched, bearing witness to the consequences of cruelty. Captain Obi walked down the aisle toward Evangeline's seat. When she reached it, she knelt down, bringing herself to eye level with the woman who had nearly died on her aircraft. Ms. Hartwell, I apologize on behalf of this airline and this crew. What happened to you was inexcusable. I've suspended the flight attendant responsible, and I can assure you she will be terminated. Are you feeling well enough to continue, or would you like us to arrange medical attention when we land? Evangeline, still hoarse but stronger now, shook her head. I'm all right, Captain. Thanks to this young lady here. She placed her hand on Blossom's shoulder. Captain Obi turned her attention to Blossom, and her stern expression softened into something warm and full of admiration. What's your name, sweetheart? Blossom Okafor. Well, Blossom Okafor, you are one of the bravest people I've ever met. You saved a life today. Do you understand that? You're a hero. Blossom ducked her head, suddenly shy, but a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. Captain Obi stood and addressed the entire cabin, her voice carrying to every seat. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your patience during this emergency. I also want to acknowledge young Blossom here, who demonstrated more courage and humanity than many adults ever will. Let's give her the recognition she deserves. The cabin erupted in applause for the second time, but this time it was louder, more sustained, more full of genuine appreciation and respect. Passengers stood, giving Blossom a standing ovation. Some were crying. Some were recording. All of them were witnessing something they would remember and talk about for the rest of their lives. The young woman with purple hair who had been live-streaming was sobbing as she filmed, her voice breaking as she told her viewers, "This is what courage looks like. This is what we should all aspire to be." Captain Obi returned to the cockpit, but not before stopping to speak with Jidenna. You've raised an exceptional daughter, Mr. Okafor. The world needs more people like her. Jidenna could only nod, too overwhelmed with emotion to trust his voice. The rest of the flight passed in a strange mixture of celebration and anticipation. Passengers kept approaching Blossom and Jidenna to express their gratitude, to tell them how inspired they were, to ask if they could take a photo with the brave little girl. Blossom handled it all with a mixture of shyness and growing confidence, her father's hand always on her shoulder, anchoring her. Evangeline used the time to rest and recover, but also to have the flight attendants bring her Jidenna's contact information. She wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. She had found something rare in the business world, a person of genuine integrity and courage. She wanted to make sure he knew she was serious about that contract. When the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, You could feel the tension ratchet up again. Everyone knew what was about to happen. Everyone was waiting to see justice served. The landing was smooth, Captain Obi's 30 years of experience evident in the gentle touchdown. But instead of taxiing to the gate, the plane pulled into a remote area of the tarmac. Through the windows, passengers could see airport security vehicles, their lights flashing, surrounding the aircraft. Captain Obi's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived in Los Angeles. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Airport security will be boarding to handle an administrative matter before we proceed to the gate. Thank you for your cooperation." The aircraft door opened and 4 security officers boarded, their expressions professional and serious. Captain Obi emerged from the cockpit once more and led them to the back of the plane, where Mariana had been sequestered. Passengers craned their necks to watch as Mariana was escorted forward. She looked completely different from the confident, authoritative flight attendant who had boarded in Atlanta. Her hair had come loose from its tight bun. Her makeup was smeared from crying. Her uniform was wrinkled and stained. But more than her physical appearance, it was her demeanor that had changed. She looked small, defeated, broken. She kept her eyes on the floor as she was led down the aisle. She didn't look at the passengers who watched her pass. She didn't try to defend herself or explain. She just walked, surrounded by security, toward a future that had been destroyed by her own choices. As she reached the exit, one security officer paused to address the cabin. "On behalf of Los Angeles International Airport and the airline, we apologize for any distress this incident caused. The individual in question has been removed from duty and will be escorted from airport property. Thank you for your patience." Mariana disappeared through the door, and the cabin remained silent for a long moment. It was the silence of justice being served, of consequences being delivered, of the world proving that sometimes the right thing happens. Then, as if on cue, one person began to clap. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire cabin was applauding again, but this time it wasn't for Blossom. It was for Captain Obi, for the security officers, for the system that had actually worked the way it was supposed to work. The plane taxied to the gate, and as passengers began to disembark, many of them stopped to hug Blossom, to shake Jidenna's hand, to thank them for reminding everyone what courage looked like. When Blossom and Jidenna finally walked off the plane, the gate area erupted in applause. Word had spread. Airport employees, passengers from other flights, even TSA agents were clapping and cheering. Someone had made a sign that read, "Hero on board," with an arrow pointing at Blossom. The little girl in the purple butterfly dress walked through the terminal holding her father's hand, and everywhere she looked, people were smiling at her, celebrating her, recognizing her courage. But the story didn't end there. The narrator needs you to understand what happened in the days and weeks that followed, because justice at 45,000 feet had consequences that reached far beyond that single flight. Within hours of landing, the airline released a statement. It was carefully worded by legal teams but unambiguous in its content. Mariana Svensson had been terminated for gross misconduct and violation of company values. The statement expressed deep regret for the incident and outlined new training protocols for recognizing and addressing unconscious bias among crew members. But Mariana's termination was just the beginning. The videos from the flight had gone viral, viewed tens of millions of times across every social media platform. News outlets picked up the story. Civil rights organizations used it as an example of systemic discrimination. Aviation industry watchdogs demanded policy changes. Within a week, every major airline in the country had blacklisted Mariana Svensson. Her name was added to do not hire lists. Her aviation credentials were reviewed and, in some cases, revoked. She became the face of everything wrong with unchecked discrimination, her image appearing in training videos and diversity seminars as an example of what not to do. Her career in aviation was over. Her reputation was destroyed. And unlike the countless times she had inflicted small cruelties and gotten away with it, this time there was no plausible deniability. This time the evidence was recorded from multiple angles, time-stamped and shared with the world. This time she couldn't hide behind professionalism or claim misunderstanding. This time her choices had permanent consequences. But while Mariana's life was falling apart, something beautiful was happening for the Okafor family. 1 week after that flight, Jidenna Okafor sat in the conference room of Hartwell Global Development's Los Angeles headquarters. The room was stunning, all floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of downtown LA, modern furniture that probably cost more than his monthly office rent, abstract art on the walls that he recognized from a museum exhibit he'd taken Blossom to see. Across the table sat Evangeline Hartwell, fully recovered now, looking every bit the powerful CEO in a tailored navy suit. Beside her were her VP of Operations, her head legal counsel, and her chief financial officer. Jidenna had presented his portfolio, his vision, his proposals for sustainable construction practices. He had answered every question with honesty and expertise, drawing on 26 years of experience, on lessons learned from failures as well as successes, on a genuine passion for building things that mattered. And at the end of it, Evangeline had slid a contract across the table. "Welcome to the team, Mr. Okafor. We're looking forward to building something remarkable together." The contract was for $1.2 million. It secured Okafor and Sons as the primary construction contractor for the first phase of Hartwell Global's Los Angeles mixed-use development, with options for additional phases that could total over $5 million in the coming years. Jidenna's company was saved. More than saved, it was positioned to grow, to thrive, to finally receive the recognition and opportunity it had always deserved. His daughter's future was secured. The promise he had made to his wife was honored. And all of it because Blossom had decided that saving a life was more important than playing it safe. But perhaps the most beautiful consequence of that day at 45,000 feet was the relationship that formed between Evangeline and Blossom. They became close as grandmother and granddaughter. Evangeline, who had never had children of her own, found in Blossom the daughter she had always wanted. And Blossom, who had lost her mother too young, found in Evangeline a mentor, a role model, a woman who showed her what she could become. They met for lunch every Saturday. Evangeline took Blossom to museums, to her office, to construction sites where Blossom wore a hard hat that was 3 sizes too big and asked questions that made the engineers smile. She told Blossom stories about building her company, about facing discrimination, about never giving up on your dreams no matter how many people told you they were impossible. And Blossom soaked it all in, growing more confident, more certain of her own strength and potential with every conversation. At 45,000 feet in the air, an 8-year-old girl had proved that courage doesn't have an age requirement. That bravery doesn't require size or strength or authority. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to stand by when someone needs help. Blossom didn't see a wealthy CEO when she looked at Evangeline choking in that aisle. She didn't see a flight attendant with authority when she looked at Mariana holding that cup of water. She saw a human being who needed help and another human being who was refusing to provide it. And she acted. She didn't calculate the risks. She didn't worry about the consequences. She didn't let fear or doubt or the weight of adult approval stop her. She just did what her mother had taught her, what her father had modeled for her, what her own heart told her was right. And in doing so, she saved a life, changed her family's future, and reminded 200 passengers and millions of people watching from around the world that courage still exists. That goodness still matters. That one person, even a very small person in a purple butterfly dress, can make a difference. Sometimes the smallest hands carry the biggest hearts. Sometimes the quietest voices speak the loudest truths. Sometimes the most powerful act is the simplest one. Seeing someone who needs help and deciding that nothing else matters more than providing it. That's what Blossom did at 45,000 feet. And the world, for once, rewarded her courage with exactly the kind of justice and opportunity she deserved. If Blossom's courage inspired you, if her story reminded you that doing the right thing matters even when it's hard, hit that like button right now. If you believe in standing up for what's right no matter the cost, subscribe to this channel because we need more stories like this. Stories that remind us who we're supposed to be. Stories that show us what courage looks like. And tell us in the comments, would you have done what Blossom did? Have you ever had to choose between safety and doing the right thing? What did you choose and how did it change you? Share your story below because every act of courage, no matter how small, matters. Justice served at 45,000 feet. And somewhere right now, an 8-year-old girl in a purple butterfly dress is reminding us all that heroes come in every size, every age, every color. All they need is the courage to act when the moment calls for it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for believing that courage still matters. And thank you for being the kind of person who would stop to help, who would stand up to injustice, who would be like Blossom when the world needs it most.